On April 16, 2014, while a nation watched the Sewol Ferry disaster unfold on live TV, one citizen had an idea. A desperate, urgent idea. Today, we're going to break down the story of their attempt to be heard and what they describe as the system that was built to ignore them. Can you imagine screaming this at your television? Well, that's exactly what our source remembers doing. It was this raw, frantic plea, born from seeing the ferry overturned, but, and this is key, still floating. They just believed there was still a chance, still time. And this one simple, desperate idea, it set them on a collision course with a massive wall of bureaucracy. All right, so first up, let's talk about that desperate call and the deaf system that, in their view, was on the other end of the line. So picture it. They're at home, glued to these horrifying images on the news. The ship is upside down, sure, but a big chunk of its hull is still above the water. And in that moment, they didn't just see a tragedy in progress. They saw a window of opportunity, a chance, maybe, to buy just a little more precious time for the hundreds of students trapped inside. So what do? They pick up the phone and call 119, the emergency line. Their idea was just rooted in basic physics. It felt so obvious, so critical, that they just had to tell someone in charge and tell them right away. We're not talking about some complex military strategy here. It was just a simple concept to try and keep hope alive. But that urgent plea, it just went nowhere. The author describes the feeling of their voice just hitting a wall, becoming an empty echo. They're absolutely convinced that their message, this potential lifeline, never even got close to the command center at the scene. It was just swallowed by the system. So you're probably wondering, what was this idea? Let's actually break down the logic behind this oxygen tank proposal. The whole plan, everything, hinged on this one concept, the air pocket. Now, this is a pretty common thing in capsized ships, right? Trapped air creates a little space where people might be able to survive. But the author's idea wasn't just about hoping the air pocket held out. It was about actively making it bigger, stronger, and more stable. The plan was actually kind of brilliant because it did two things at once. Step one, get every single oxygen tank you can find. Industrial ones, medical ones, you name it. Step two, pump that oxygen straight into the ship's hull. This would do two critical things. First, expand that air pocket, giving survivors more precious air to breathe. And second, it would add buoyancy, literally helping to keep the ship from sinking as fast. More air and more time. It was that simple. But while our author is desperately trying to get this idea through to anyone who will listen, a piece of news breaks that, in their opinion, completely derailed the entire rescue effort. It was a catastrophic falsehood. Now, have a look at this timeline, because it shows the exact moment things went so wrong. Just when the rescues should have been ramping up into high gear, at 11:01 a.m., this headline flashes across the entire country. All Danwon High School students rescued. And for a moment, there was this huge national sigh of relief. But it was a devastating lie. By the time the truth came out that afternoon, the damage was already done. And according to the author, the fallout from that one false report was immediate and it was catastrophic. All of that incredible tension, that urgency at the scene, it just evaporated. Civilian divers who were rushing to help were reportedly blocked from even getting to the site. The whole country breathed this tragically premature sigh of relief. And the mission's focus, they argue, shifted from a desperate all-out rescue to simply controlling the scene. Okay, so let's fast forward 10 years. A single moment brings all of this frustration, this anger, rushing right back to the surface for the author. A decade goes by, and the author is watching a parliamentary hearing on TV, and they see a face they recognize. It's the person who was the head of the news division that put out that false all-rescued report. And not only was this person not disgraced, they were actually in line for an even more powerful job. And in the author's eyes, they were showing zero remorse. And that's when it just clicked. It was this devastating realization. Seeing that executive just thriving, they finally understood. The system wasn't just inefficient, it was indifferent. It was never designed to listen to an outsider's idea, no matter how logical or how desperate they were. That frantic phone call was doomed from the very start. This table, wow. It really just lays out the author's cynical conclusion about what that system's priorities really were. Look at the left column. What mattered? Avoiding responsibility, following protocol, maintaining their own positions. And on the right, what didn't matter? Saving the children, making use of that critical golden hour, or, listening to a potentially life-saving idea from a citizen. This profound sense of disillusionment with the human-led bureaucracy, well, it led the author to a really fascinating and very modern thought experiment. What if you took the humans out of the equation? What if the disaster response wasn't run by people worried about their careers and public image? What if it was all controlled by an AI, an artificial intelligence programmed with just one single, absolute directive? Prioritize human life. Period. And when you put the two side by side, the contrast the author paints is just stark. The human system, it's worried about political fallout and who's going to get the blame. It follows rigid, outdated rules. But the AI, it would ignore politics. It wouldn't care about blame. It would just calculate survival probabilities. It wouldn't be stuck on protocol. It would simulate a new ideal, like the oxygen tanks, in a split second and immediately execute the most logical solution. And this is the response the author imagines that AI would have given. Just cold, logical, and immediate. Physics check. High validity. Survival probability. Plus 20%. Command. Execute immediately. No emotion, no ego. Just data, probability, and a command to act. And it's a chilling thought, right? That a machine might have been more humane in its cold efficiency than the actual humans in charge. So after all this reflection, what's left? What is our duty in all of this? The author believes, above all else, we have a duty to remember, to make sure something like this can never, ever happen again. This is what the author calls society's answer sheet, a checklist of what we need to do. Remember that feeling of total powerlessness watching the events unfold? Remember the names of every single victim. Remember the faces of those who failed them, whether through incompetence or indifference. And finally, commit to dismantling the kind of system that proved it valued ceremony and status over actual human lives. And this number, this is the ultimate cost of that systemic failure. 304 lives. So, this is the question the author leaves us with. And it's not just about remembering a tragedy. It's about our collective duty to demand accountability, to challenge broken systems, and to fight for a world where when a desperate voice calls out with an idea to save a life, someone is actually there, listening.